Their ambitions brought them to the heart of the nation's affairs. They were descended from a national hero and bred in the ducal palace named for his greatest victory. They were gamblers in politics and life, and when aristocratic privilege blended with American drive, they produced the most prodigal genius of all. But genius makes up its own rules.
It was like being in a meteor's train, really.
There was this invaluable streak of, some would say, ruthlessness, some would say vulgarity, but it was different from the ordinary run of English gentlemen turned into politicians.
We mustn't use the word empire. It's naughty. Yes! They tell us we mustn't use the word British.
I mean, people often say, goodness, it must be wonderful to be a Churchill. And in many ways, of course, it is. I personally didn't find being a young Churchill, or even a Churchill now, particularly comfortable.
The public profile had a private price. And sooner or later, the Churchills had to pay. (1873), the summer season. The cream of British society had gathered for the annual regatta at Cowes. One evening in July, there was a ball on board one of the yachts. Among those who were invited was the daughter of an American tycoon. Jenny Jerome was just 19 years old. Also there was Lord Randolph Churchill, second son of the Duke of Marlborough.
She met Randolph. Now, Randolph didn't like society very much. He couldn't dance, but he tried. And I believe after about half a dozen steps, Jeanette, as she called herself then, suggested they should sit down for a rest. So they sat down, and for the rest of the evening, they never stopped talking. When she went home with her two sisters, she announced that she'd met the man she was going to marry.
Three days later, when Randolph proposed, Jenny instantly accepted. She would enter one of the great families of English history.
His father said, well, who is she? Well, Randolph didn't know. He said he believed she was American and her father did something in America. The Duke said, well, I don't think it's appropriate that you should get married so young. And being an American, I don't think really she fits in with our society.
Despite the Duke's opposition and legal wrangles about money, they were married within the year. But when they visited Blenheim Palace, the vast pile built for Randolph's ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, Jenny was chilled by the atmosphere.
The fact is, I loathe living here. It is not on account of its dullness, that I don't mind, but the Duchess hates me simply for what I am. Everything I do or say or wear is found fault with.
Only 7 months after the wedding, Jenny was at Blenheim when she unexpectedly went into labor. Jenny was rushed to a ground floor cloakroom where on the 30th of November 1874, she gave birth to a son. Winston Spencer Churchill was born into the heart of the aristocracy, but the Churchills were not quite what they appeared.
The Churchills or the Marlboroughs are an interesting case about aristocratic development. I mean, they behave like 18th century aristocrats. They get into debt, they have scandalous relationships with women, they're incredibly rude to people, they're rackety, and they stay rackety. There are blips of respectability, and Lord Randolph's parents, the 7th Duke and his Duchess, were respectable. They were rather churchy, they were decent, but their children reverted gloriously to type.
Although Randolph and Jeannie could not afford to live in the grand style, they did. Handing the new baby over to a nanny, they set out to enjoy themselves. Randolph liked country pursuits, but when elected to the family seat in Parliament, he found politics was the finest blood sport of all.
I have tried all forms of excitement, from tip cat to tiger shooting, all degrees of gambling, from beggar my neighbor to Monte Carlo, but I have found no gambling like politics, and no excitement like a big division.
The last moments.
Randolph rose to prominence by harrying the political heavyweights of his time. He ridiculed Prime Minister Gladstone as an old man in a hurry.
He's the rudest politician there is. He says astonishing things about people. He played to the gallery. He was a dandy. He wore very stylish, I think, not vulgar, stylish, but slightly arresting clothes. He loved to make brutal, low jokes. He preened. When he got on the stage, he inflated. He became a great star, which he was.
The parliamentary leaders were trying to appeal to a new, wider electorate. The ineffectual leadership of the Tory party knew that it needed a champion with mass appeal. Lord Randolph had charisma. Even his opponents feared his caressing charm as much as his jibes. Above all, he knew how to play the press.
The use of publicity, this incessant cultivation of journalists, the fact that quite early on the Press Association has a list of who gets quoted in what proportion for their speeches, you know, whether you print 50% of someone's speech or not. Churchill, they print everything he says. And this is very important in how Churchill becomes, as everyone by the mid-80s thinks he will be, the leader in waiting to the Tory party.
In the 1884 general election, Churchill's tactics were vindicated. The Tories were elected, and Lord Randolph became Secretary of State for India in the new government. During the election, Jenny had campaigned alongside him. Now she became a formidable political hostess.
She'd walk into a room and she opened up the room. It was a magical kind of thing. It wasn't just beauty and it wasn't just charisma. There was something almost chemical about it. It was her spirit. She had the spirit. There was a fire in her and people felt it.
With her beauty and skills, Jenny was one of the ornaments of London society.
She was a magnificent horsewoman. She rode astride, which was unthinkable, of course, in England. She was musical. She played the piano. When I was quite small, I would listen to her playing, and it enthralled me. She would play in the evening, and the melodies go through my mind even today. I've still got her scores, which were printed with her name on the outside, and they're in my library.
In 1880, Jenny gave birth to the couple's second child, Jack. Their busy schedule left little time for Winston, who was a tempestuous and demanding child.
I just think he was an impossible child in some ways. I mean, if he'd been my child, I think I would have adored him, but felt you'd need to be constantly almost protecting him because he would be putting people's backs up all around the place. But if he was my child's best friend, I would have been fairly hesitant about asking him to come and stay for the holidays.
At the age of 7, Winston was sent off to school.
My dear Mamma, I hope you are quite well. I am wondering when you are coming to see me. I hope you are coming to see me soon. I am very glad Papa got in for South.
Winston frequently wrote to his parents begging for more attention.
That was a victory. My darling Papa, I have been out riding with a gentleman who thinks that Gladstone is a brute and thinks that the one with the curly moustache ought to be Premier. Everybody wants your autograph, but I can only say I will try, and I should like you to sign your name in full at the end of your letter. With love and kisses, I remain your loving Winston.
Unknown to Winston, his father's career was in peril. Lord Randolph was a sick man. In 1882, he was absent from Westminster for 8 months without explanation.
Lord Randolph's illness is a matter for conjecture, as anyone's illness over 100 years ago must be. We don't have detailed diagnoses of his illness. We do know that from a pretty early stage, certainly the mid-80s, he was seeing a doctor who was a specialist in syphilis.
Randolph had probably contracted the disease before he met Jenny.
Syphilis is contagious at the very beginning. And after that, it's not so contagious, which is why Jenny didn't get it, which is why she didn't transmit it to her children. The thing about syphilis is there could be long periods of remission when you're perfectly normal, and it can be a very slow-acting disease sometimes. And there were very primitive treatments for it, but as soon as she found out he had it, it sort of killed the sex life. She started living her own life in terms of men. That's when the Prince of Wales became her lover. That's when Count Kinsky became her lover. He was an Austrian who won the Grand National and was the hero of Great Britain. She was very, very selective about the men in her life. They were always the most interesting, the most important, the most handsome. She was very, very selective.
Randolph was under sentence of death. In those days, syphilis was incurable. He now suspected that he would die young and possibly insane.
I think it explains quite a lot about his breakneck tactics from about 1885. He knows he doesn't have much time. And this is also very important in terms of his relationship with his children. He doesn't have much time for them either. He's a man who feels that his time is running out and who is frantically scrabbling to the top.
Randolph's recklessness would be his undoing.
At his own leader's house, Lord Salisbury's great house, Hatfield, when Churchill is his Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's dining and he's sitting near the redoubtable Lady Salisbury, and he's heard to say very loudly, "Bad dinner, cold plates, beastly wine." And this, of course, isn't going to endear him to the kind of people on whom his political future depends.
Randolph was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the age of 37, a young man in a desperate hurry. After only 3 months in office, he believed himself indispensable. When he offered his resignation on a minor issue, he was astonished when Lord Salisbury accepted it with relief.
He finally broke his whole potential career just in pieces when he decided to resign without telling Jenny or anybody else. Just wrote on a very small point of political principle. He sent a note resigning, and that was the end of his career. And Jenny was desolate because she felt that he really could have been Prime Minister of England. And he could have been.
Winston followed the drama from school. A rebellious pupil who seemed not to try in most classes, he excelled at English and history. He was put into the class bound for the military academy at Sandhurst.
He was unhappy at school. His father clearly thought he was a dolt and not even clever enough to get into the proper army. And, you know, underestimating him, but one has to realize that when Winston Churchill was about 16, it was then that his father began to deteriorate rapidly, mentally, and he was abroad a great deal. And so they saw, in effect, very little of each other. But the young Winston revered his father.
Yet he received a brutal snub when he passed into Sandhurst.
My dear Winston, I am rather surprised at your tone of exultation over your inclusion in the Sandhurst list. With all the advantages you had, with all the abilities which you foolishly think yourself to possess, this is the grand result, that you come up among the second and third rate, who are only good for commissions in a cavalry regiment. I am certain that you will become a mere social wastrel, one of the hundreds of public school failures, and you will degenerate into a shabby, unhappy, and futile existence. Your mother sends her love. Your affectionate father, Randolph.
Well, I think that it was an appalling letter, and he was outraged that Winston seemed to have not achieved the right amount of marks to get into the infantry and only achieved the cavalry. Winston wanted to go into the cavalry anyway, but they were very hard up. And it was much cheaper to be in the infantry, and you didn't need all those horses and the polo ponies and all of that. And I don't think Winston realized how desperately worried about money his father was.
All his life, Randolph had gambled heavily and spent recklessly. He kept racehorses and fast company. His need for money led to unwise transactions.
One of his closest friends was Nathaniel Rothschild, Natty Rothschild. And when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, to people's horror, Lord Randolph seemed to take advice from the Rothschilds far more closely than from any elected politician or cabinet member. When he was Secretary of State for India, he did his best to cut in the Rothschilds on every monopoly going, whether it was the Burmese ruby mines or railways on the northwestern frontier. When he died, he owed Rothschild's bank £66,000, an enormous amount of money at the time. He was effectively bankrolled by Rothschilds. This, had it been known, would have been a pretty large-scale scandal.
Throughout Randolph's mortal illness, its true nature was kept secret. Jenny wrote to her sister, "It could be hard if it got out. It would do incalculable harm to his political reputation and be a dreadful thing for all of us." By 1893, Randolph, as a friend remembered, was dying by inches in public.
He was absolutely unpredictable in Parliament. I mean, he would do mad things. Even Queen Victoria said this man is mad. I mean, you never knew what he would say next, when he would have a kind of a hysterical outburst that had no sense at all. And so they begged Jenny to take him out of the country, and she took him on this trip around the world for a year. And they even traveled with a lead-lined coffin, because they never knew when he was going to die. And once he even confronted her with a revolver, you know, and she had to take it away from him. She said she didn't mind when he was weak and helpless, but when he was maniacal, you know, he could do anything. And it was a fearful time. It was a terrible thing for any woman to have to do for her husband, but she did it. She had that kind of courage and loyalty, and loyalty. And when she, and finally, when she brought him home, soon after he came home, he died.
Randolph died on the 24th of January, 1895. Winston had lost the father he hardly knew, but had long admired.
In the last years of my father's life, when I was sitting with him alone one evening at dinner, I asked him if there was anything he hadn't done that he would have liked to have done, or any honor he would have liked to have received that he hadn't received. And he paused for hardly a second and said, "Oh yes, I would have liked my father to have lived long enough to see that I was going to be some good."
(1899), the heyday of the empire. British troops were in action in South Africa, and Winston Churchill was already on his fourth war. After leaving Sandhurst, Winston had used his mother's contacts to get army postings in India and the Sudan. There he fought bravely and had ridden in the British Army's last great cavalry charge at Omdurman.
He was a soldier of fortune almost, and he took to writing dispatches as a war correspondent. And that was a period of his life when I think that he was, as it were, testing himself.
From an early age, Winston had possessed a rare skill with words. Vivid books about his exploits as a soldier earned him a lucrative contract to cover the Boer War for a London newspaper. He always reported from the thick of the action. On this occasion, his soldier brother Jack was with him.
Winston said to Jack, "You've just arrived in time, there's a battle going on, and you're just in time to join in." So they went along. Winston was standing on the horizon, explaining to Jack what was happening. The Boers were here, and the guns were over there, and the generals were doing this and that. And then he looked round, no Jack. And then, on the ground, there was my father, lying prone. He'd been shot in the leg. And Winston was reputed, according to my father, to say, "Well, you silly ass, you've only been here for 5 minutes and you get yourself shot." In the meantime, bullets were whizzing around in all directions.
Jack was one of the first soldiers to be treated on a hospital ship in Durban Harbour, run by his mother. Determined to be close to the action, Jenny had raised funds in Britain and America for the steamship Maine and its team of nurses and doctors to travel to South Africa.
It was a great adventure for her. I mean, but it was typical of her to do something like this. I mean, imagine any woman of her time organizing a hospital ship and taking it down to the war and then going to the front lines and that sort of thing.
Winston contrived to be the hero of his own reports. Riding on an armored train, he was captured during an ambush. He was held prisoner by the Boers for 3 weeks. He escaped and fled across enemy territory to the British lines. The publication of his own dramatic and racy account of these adventures made him a national hero.
Churchill's youth was a very typically aristocratic youth. The experience of war, the exhilaration of war, the chance to prove to himself and to others that he was a man of courage and vigour and energy and resource, and pulling strings via his relatives to get postings in South Africa, in the Sudan and in India. All of that was an obvious way for a young aristocrat with good connections and a large ego to promote himself and to grow up.
With Jenny beside him, he campaigned for Parliament in the northern constituency of Oldham. In 1900, he was elected to Westminster as a Conservative and followed proudly in the footsteps of Lord Randolph. Like his father, Winston was a publicity-seeking and flamboyant Member of Parliament. But whereas Randolph was a brilliant off-the-cuff speaker, Winston did not share this gift.
Speaking was something that he learned and took a lot of trouble over. which was curious because he was very good at smart repartee. My parents were living near Newcastle, and Winston was giving a speech in Newcastle. And he was furious when he arrived, and he found there wasn't a long mirror in his room. And my mother had some difficulty in finding one for him, but he insisted in having it. How could he make his speech if he couldn't rehearse it? And rehearse it so gestures and all would be carefully organized.
One day in 1904, he was speaking in the House, and it happens to all of us. Every actor knows the feeling. He just dried up and couldn't carry on. He lost his way. And it caused a terrible sensation at the time, because people with vivid memories of Lord Randolph, only 10 years before, wondered whether perhaps the son had inherited the same mental disease or affliction that had killed the father.
What Winston had inherited was his father's impatience. As Britain changed, he changed with it. After only 4 years at Westminster, he deserted the Conservatives and crossed the floor to join the radical Liberals around the dynamic Welsh MP, David Lloyd George.
He did it in a most symbolic and ostentatious way in the House of Commons, because the first time he appeared in the House of Commons after his switch, he came in and walked up and then turned sharply to the right to the Liberal benches and sat down beside Lloyd George, who was the rising star of the sort of new radical Liberals. So he was making it perfectly clear, not only he was joining the Liberals, but what sort of Liberals he was associating himself with, and which Liberal in particular.
The relationship between Churchill and Lloyd George, I think, was always a very curious one. They rather respected each other as rogues. But on the whole, Churchill was a more attractive rogue, I think, than Lloyd George. But Lloyd George was perhaps the shrewder politician.
Churchill was a genuine social reformer, though some doubted it. One said, Winston has just discovered the poor, whom he thinks he has been sent by God to do something about. Yet, in partnership with Lloyd George, Winston pushed through reforms which began pensions and insurance for all.
Churchill found himself defending these liberal measures and, as it were, the democratically elected lower house against the aristocratic upper house. And so for many aristocrats, who are indeed Churchill's relatives, he is a traitor to his class.
When he met Lady Londonderry, I think he said, somewhere in the park or wherever, and bowed and raised his hat to her, and he said, she just did this, and he snorted like a sea lion. He was very unpopular with his former Conservative colleagues.
When Winston was 30 and one of London's most eligible bachelors, he had attended a ball in fashionable Mayfair with his mother. His eye fell on one of the dancers, Clementine Hosier.
My father said to his mother, who was there, who is that simply beautiful girl the other side of the room? So, with Papa in tow, Lady Randolph sailed across the ballroom and introduced herself to Clementine, who was standing there and saying, I'm an old friend of your mother's. This is my son, Winston Churchill. My father, instead of saying something, just stood there, rooted to the spot, sort of staring. And my mother was somewhat disconcerted. She made a little signal to one of her beaux, who was standing not far away, who instantly came up and whirled her away on the dance floor and said to her, whatever were you doing talking to that frightful bounder, Winston Churchill?
Clementine was not as well connected as Winston, but she was better educated, a talented linguist and a lifelong Liberal. 4 years later, he met Clementine again. This time, he took the trouble to court her. He charmed and captivated her despite her doubts. They fell in love, and Winston took Clementine to Blenheim, just as Randolph had taken Jenny 30 years before.
his cousin, the Duke of Marlborough, came up to his bedroom and said, "Look here, Winston, if you mean to marry that girl, I think you better get up and go down and ask her to marry her, because otherwise she's going to be off before lunch." And so I leapt out of bed, got dressed, rushed down, and took my mother for a walk in the grounds. They ended up in this lovely temple where he proposed to her.
When Winston married Clemmie in 1908, it was the society wedding of the year. But for his mother, there was a certain sadness. The marriage meant that Jenny would no longer be Winston's closest confidant. Clemmie would now take that role. Jenny remained a leading figure in London society and the focus of much newspaper attention. She married twice after Randolph. Both husbands were 20 years younger than herself, the last even younger than her son.
She said, "My second marriage was romantic, but not successful. My third marriage was successful, but not romantic. As a matter of fact, I talked to her third husband just before he died. He said, I know what people said, you know, marrying this younger man and everything. I remember, you know, he said, I just want to tell you one thing," he said to me. "There was never a dull moment."
In 1911, aged only 36, Churchill was Home Secretary when a band of anarchists was besieged at a house in Sydney Street in East London. Churchill rushed to the scene and seemed to take charge of the operation. During the siege, the house caught fire. Churchill held back the fire brigade until the house was well ablaze. 2 men were killed inside. Winston wrote to Prime Minister Asquith,
"I thought it better to let the house burn down than spend good British lives in rescuing those ferocious rascals."
Ebullient and forceful, Churchill was at the height of his powers. He was moved to the Admiralty. War with Germany was approaching, and for 4 years he directed the most powerful naval force in the world. When war came, the fleet was ready. But shortly after the conflict broke out, Churchill's tactical rashness led to a tragic blunder. The war in France was bogged down in the trenches, and Churchill came up with the idea of attacking Germany's southern ally, Turkey, in the Dardanelles Straits. A premature naval assault failed. Later, when the army landed at Gallipoli, the Turks were forewarned and ready. Thousands of troops were killed. It was a major disaster.
We have a charming way in this country that when something goes wrong, we have to find a scapegoat. It can't possibly be my fault, or it can't possibly be spread around. And there was Churchill, this young, buccaneering, adventurous. And when he described Gallipoli as a legitimate war gamble, the relatives of the 46,000 who died didn't take that at all well.
Winston was forced to resign from the Admiralty and demoted. Trained for war, he was no longer trusted to wage it. He sank into a deep depression. He lost his official residence and was suddenly homeless. He and Clemmie, with their 3 children, went to live with his brother Jack and his family.
Winston first occupied his time borrowing my brother's Meccano set and started building a model of the Forth Bridge. Carloads of Meccano were delivered at the door, and the bridge went right across the hall, blocking the dining room door. It was a great inconvenience to everybody, but it was obviously a bit of Winston's therapy, essential to do this.
Winston's isolation within the government worsened. He resigned altogether when the Asquith cabinet decided to pull out of the Dardanelles. It was the worst setback of his career.
Mrs. Churchill, when I talked to her about this, which I did on a number of occasions, she said once, I thought Winston would die of grief. And it was the grief of being misunderstood, and above all, the grief that he couldn't participate in what he called the war-making power of Britain. And she shared this belief. It's extraordinary. She perhaps felt it even more strongly than he did at that time. And she wrote a violent letter to the Prime Minister, which he described as a letter of a maniac, in which she said, why do you give up Winston, who is the only person in your government who has this power to lead Britain on to victory?
If Winston could not be part of the government's war-making machinery, he was determined to make war himself. At the age of 42, he set off to join his brother Jack, fighting in France.
It is a wild scene, filth and rubbish everywhere. Troops of enormous rats creep and glide to the unceasing accompaniment of rifle and machine guns. Amid these surroundings, I have found happiness and content such as I have not found for months.
I live from day to day in suspense and anguish. I can just bear it, feeling that you are really happy. I've ceased to have ambitions for you. Just come back to me alive, that's all.
In 1915, while Churchill was commanding a battalion in France, he and Clemmie wrote to each other nearly every day. Even from the battlefield, he pressed Clemmie to lobby his political friends. She found it hard to keep up with his instructions.
Don't scold me for being a hermit. Here, in 2 days, I've hobnobbed with Montague, Birrell, Lloyd George, and a South African potentate. Tomorrow night, I'm dining with Castle. Please send home the Distinguished Conduct Medal at once, and much praise.
You have indeed been active, seeing all those people. Persevere. The Distinguished Conduct Medal is yours.
In June 1916, Winston returned home to Clemmie and to the political fray. The Tories were still deeply hostile to Churchill, but his old ally Lloyd George, now the Prime Minister, took the risk of bringing Churchill back into the coalition government.
He always felt that Churchill should be back because of his talents. He felt that you couldn't afford to have somebody as talented as that outside the government. And there was such an outcry from the Conservatives that for a time it looked as though the government might fall. I mean, he nearly broke the government by bringing Churchill back, but he got away with it.
When the war ended, Lloyd George put Churchill in charge of the War Ministry. While Lloyd George was away at the peace negotiations, Churchill committed British troops to fight with the anti-Bolshevik armies in Russia. It was another disastrous mistake. Cartoonists and the press had a field day with his violent changes of direction. His career was already crippled by memories of the Gallipoli campaign. Now, Churchill's belligerent attack on socialism in Russia reawakened public fears about his judgment.
Churchill hated Bolshevism. In one sense, I suppose that is the best of Churchill. He was early on to notice that there were many things about the Bolshevik regime which were pretty unpleasant. But it was also the worst of Churchill in that, in a sense, what went on in Russia was none of his business, and in the sense that the last thing anybody in Britain wanted, having had one war against Germany, which had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, was now to start another war against Russia. And in that sense, it was totally ludicrous, and he got the whole thing completely out of proportion.
The cabinet forced Churchill to withdraw the troops from Russia. This political humiliation was followed by a family tragedy. In June 1921, Winston's 67-year-old mother, Jenny, had a fall and had to have her leg amputated. While convalescing, she suffered a sudden hemorrhage. Winston ran through the streets in his pajamas to reach his mother. It was too late. She was dead. By now, Winston and Clemmie had 4 children. Diana was born in 1909, followed 2 years later by a boy, Randolph. Sarah was born in 1914, baby Marigold in 1919. In August 1921, the children were on holiday with their nanny when Marigold developed a sore throat. She became gravely ill with septicemia. Winston and Clemmie rushed to Marigold's bedside as her life slipped away. She was 2 years and 9 months.
His daughter Marigold died as a small girl, a very small girl. And I always thought that those who said that he was not very interested and didn't care very much for his family ought to have heard him tell of her death, which he did many, many years later in the 1950s, to me one night. I'm trying to remember his words. He said, she said, so tired, and died. And he said, Clemmie screamed as though she was under torture. It was very moving.
Winston and Clemmie were united in their grief. A year later, their 5th child, Mary, was born. Clemmie was now anxious that the couple should establish a more settled home for their growing family. Characteristically, Winston made the decision by himself. He would buy Churchill Manor in Kent.
When she first saw Churchill and the beautiful valley, she liked it and thought it was a wonderful view. But when she came to look at the very run-down Victorian house and realized with her Scottish practicality everything that had to be done to it, she was appalled and hoped my father wouldn't buy it. And he actually bought it behind her back while she was busy having me, and she never quite forgave him for it, I don't think.
Though he revelled in Churchill, Churchill's mind soon returned to his shaky political base. The Lloyd George coalition government was collapsing. Stricken with appendicitis, he fought most of the 1922 general election campaign from his hospital bed and lost his seat in Dundee. The Liberals were split, and the Tories returned to power. Churchill wrote,
"In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix."
Ever the opportunist, Churchill flirted with the Conservative Party as hostility to socialism became his dominant theme. But some Tories were not enthusiastic.
The Conservatives thought he was a liability and were determined to stop him coming into the party, and they started these rumours. A nasty little boy, whose name I won't mention because I think he's still alive, came up to me and said, my daddy says that all Churchills are mad and have horrible diseases. This was the propaganda that the Conservative Central Office was putting out.
Winston fought 3 elections in 2 years, each time in different constituencies and political labels, before he was returned as member for Epping in Essex. He immediately joined the Conservatives once more. To general surprise, the new Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, asked the renegade Liberal to be his Chancellor of the Exchequer. His eyes filled with tears, and he replied, "I shall be proud to serve you in this splendid office." He now had the job his father once held.
Churchill was often accused throughout his life of being an opportunist, and as Lord Beaverbrook once said, he'd held every opinion on every question. There appeared to be a sense in which he could just change his mind all the time, just as his father had. And that in that sense he really did appear to be an unscrupulous and unprincipled adventurer. On the other hand, there were, I think, certain things that Churchill did believe in all the time. He did believe in the greatness of Britain, he did believe in the British Empire, he did believe in a certain sort of parliamentary democracy, and while that may not count as a very impressive or original ideological package to carry around with you. It's probably as much as most politicians have, and maybe even more.
On Budget Day, Churchill walked to the House of Commons accompanied by his family. Once again, he was the focus of attention at the heart of British politics. As Chancellor, he unwisely tied the pound to the gold standard when the economy was too weak to sustain it. Exports slumped, industrial production fell sharply, employers cut wages and laid off workers. It was a time of industrial militancy. The trade unions called an unprecedented general strike.
This is London calling the British Isles. With all public transport paralysed, those who still had work to go to had to find their own means of getting there. The government's appeal for volunteers is being answered.
Churchill edited the government's propaganda broadsheet, the British Gazette, with his customary vigour. He urged all-out resistance. "We are at war," he wrote.
This is London calling the British Isles. After 5 days of strike, the deadlock continues.
After 9 days, the strike was called off. The unions were defeated. They would have their revenge on Churchill and the Tories. At the next general election, as the economic recession deepened, the country voted against the Tories. The Labour Party formed a new government with different priorities. Churchill seemed beached by this new tide.
One of the ways that Churchill evolves during this long span of time he's in public life is from being the man who appears to be on the side of the underdog and of the working classes in the late 1900s and early 1910s when he's a liberal, to the man who is seen by the mid and late 1920s as a kind of belligerent class warrior. On the left, he was never really forgiven for being, as they say it, a union basher at the time of the general strike, and his earlier career as a man much concerned about the welfare of ordinary people was really quite forgotten.
Contemporaries saw Churchill as an aristocratic relic of a bygone era. Out of power and out of sympathy at times, he retreated to his country home. Winston enjoyed the building and remodelling of the house and grounds at Churchill. The younger children were drafted in as labourers. Randolph joined his father to welcome the stream of influential visitors who came to Churchill.
Anyone who was anybody in the world, sooner or later, visited Churchill. And I find it absolutely exhilarating. One came away from Churchill transformed, full of any worries you had disappeared, and life looked rosy and opportunities around any corner.
Churchill enjoyed the pursuits of a country gentleman, but like his father, Winston had a weakness for unpredictable company. Much to Clemmie's horror, Winston preferred to gather raffish outsiders, newspaper magnates, financiers, and political adventurers like F.E. Smith to Churchill for lunch. Exposure to this privileged and indulgent lifestyle caused problems for all the children, but the effect was most marked on Randolph.
Now, I don't know without causing offence, I can describe some of those lunches. Well, I mean, what would happen is that Randolph was encouraged to join in the debates. Now, he was in sort of in his teens, and there was always celebrities there, people like Lloyd George or F.E. Smith and so on, and they'd be debating a subject, and then Winston would turn to Randolph and say, "What do you think about this?"
Come over to the United States on a lecture tour, because I think that one of the greatest things in the world is that the young people of great nations should get to know each other and understand each other's point of view. And as I am so young, I hope in the time that I am in the United States to be able to educate myself at least a little in some of the more important elements and viewpoints of American national life.
I think my father was so determined that the distance that existed between his own father and himself would not be replicated in his son's life. And he really did give himself to being accessible to Randolph by talking to him, by being a lot with him as much as his political life allowed. And I think that early on, Randolph got the idea that he was perhaps a bit cleverer than he was, although he was clever. And anyhow, I think my father thoroughly spoilt him.
Churchill's political career seemed to be drawing to a close. The future lay with Randolph, from whom he expected great things. There were 2 William Pitts, he observed, but there would be 3 Churchills. History, however, has a way of mocking such confident predictions.
Hello, I'm Christopher Lawrence from ABC Classic FM, and after a long time away, I'm back on air this week as the new host of Drive, Mondays to Fridays from 4 in the afternoon right through to 7. So join me, Christopher Lawrence, on Drive on ABC Classic FM.
They're the people who defend
He was a man of genius, and like all men of genius, there are dark patches and there are bright patches.
Winston Churchill's genius shone in wartime, but between the wars, he backed one lost cause after another.
The public were hostile. They weren't prepared to listen to what he said. They just didn't want to know.
If Churchill had died in 1939, what would have been the epitaph? It would have been another Lord Randolph. Brilliant beginning, flickering out, and then failure.
In the 1930s, India, the British Empire's greatest possession, was racked by demonstrations for independence. Winston Churchill had spent his formative years defending the frontiers of India. When the British government offered limited self-rule to the nationalists, he attacked their leader, Gandhi, calling him a seditious lawyer and a half-naked fakir.
The Government of India bill only gave the Indians a very modest degree of self-government. But as far as Churchill was concerned, of course, it gave them much too much. And his ignorance on the subject was monumental. He had emphatic views that his father had, that the British rule in India was wholly benevolent and that nothing should be done to disturb it.
Things are going from bad to worse. Great mismanagement and weakness are causing unrest and disturbance to 300 million primitive people whose well-being is in our care.
But Churchill only gathered a small band of diehards to his cause. He seemed old-fashioned and untrustworthy, and a threat to the Tory leader, Stanley Baldwin.
Out of the Indian campaign, Winston lost a lot of credit with his own party, particularly after we'd forfeited a couple of by-elections.
One was in Wavertree in Liverpool. Here, his son Randolph stood as an independent, opposing the government on India. Churchill supported Randolph's campaign, but both were damaged by it.
He came away with 10,000 votes, which in the space of 10 days wasn't discreditable. The only trouble was he split the Tory vote and let the socialist in, and that was something that the Tory party machine never forgave him for.
Randolph had brought his sisters, Diana and Sarah, to help.
We all travelled down the train together, leaving Randolph to finish off the election. And I remember the girl saying to me on the train, if only Father was more like Randolph. When Father is going to make a speech, the whole household is absolutely hushed and on standby. Atmosphere very tense. Whereas Randolph, everything comes naturally to him. He doesn't prepare a speech, it just comes like that. In a sense, Randolph had talents which Winston didn't have.
Including a talent to embarrass his father. When Churchill fought the 1935 general election, he was handicapped by his son, who was also a candidate.
Randolph was standing on a sort of independent, arrogant, and almost anti-Baldwin conservative ticket. So father and son quarreled then, and father said to son, look, don't make things more difficult for me because I'm expecting the call. And like many a young minister before and since, he, the rather senior minister by then, sat by his telephone waiting, and the call never came.
Churchill became increasingly isolated from his own party.
People like my parents, who were backward Tories, never trusted Churchill for a minute. They thought he was an adventurer.
As part of the relationship between Churchill and the Tory party, they didn't see him as one of themselves. There was this invaluable streak of, some would say ruthlessness, some would say vulgarity, but it was different from the ordinary run of English gentlemen turned into politicians.
But he led a gentlemanly life at his country mansion, Chartwell. It was his fortress, refuge, workplace. Here he concentrated on writing his well-paid books and regular newspaper articles. The entire household revolved around him. But the household was changing as the children left home. Diana, the eldest and most diffident, escaped into marriage in 1932.
The wedding proved to be the most popular in London this season. The departure of the bride and bridegroom presented an amazing scene, for in seeking to avoid the multitude at the end of the central pathway, they retraced their steps to a side one.
The marriage itself was a false start. Diana soon married again. This time to the rising Tory politician, Duncan Sands. Her sister, Sarah, after showing early promise at Chartwell theatricals, went on the stage. There she fell in love with the comedian Vic Oliver, 18 years her senior. She decided to marry him despite her parents' disapproval.
What were you going to tell me?
Listen, Ruth, I've got a grand idea.
What is it?
Well, I can't explain to you while I'm down, see. Let's go to your house and I'll tell you all about it.
Oh, well, I don't think we could go home. You see, my family...
Well, what's the matter with it?
Oh, well, nothing, Eddie. It'll be a bit of a change from all this.
Oh, don't you worry. I've been thrown out of better homes than yours. Come on, come on.
Randolph was sent to stop the wedding, but they went ahead anyway. This marriage failed too. Winston and Clemmie remained loyal to their marriage, but they were often apart. Clemmie went off on long tropical holidays.
My darling, my thoughts are with you nearly all the time. And though basking in lovely sunshine and blue seas, I miss you and home terribly. Tender love, Clemmie.
Churchill often stayed with friends in the south of France, sometimes accompanied by Randolph.
My mother never really took to south of France society. She was always terrified that my father would gamble in the casino. He loved gambling, and he did gamble, and he lost on and off quite a bit of money. My mother was in the south of France with him on one occasion, and my father had gone off, much to her disgust, to the casino, where he was on a winning streak. And when she woke up in the morning, she felt a sort of crinkly, crunchy feeling. And when he came back, he'd covered her entirely, like the birds of the forest covered the sleeping children, with banknotes.
Money worries plagued Clemmie. For Churchill was a constant expense, and Winston was consistently extravagant. Despite his vast earnings, he was always in debt. It was a subject of frequent discussion in the family.
At luncheon, it was debated what they were going to cut down on, must save expenses. Well, it ended up that Winston and Diana must stop smoking. That's the first economy. And they didn't decide anything else. That was the end of it.
I suppose he always had this feeling within him that he was like a silkworm. He would just reel out more spools of silk.
The biggest spool was Churchill's biography of his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. He summoned the best researchers with a lordly disregard for their convenience.
I was teaching history in Oxford. I would get messages saying, expect you tomorrow. And if you said, well, you see, sir, I can't come because I'm lecturing, he would say, you know, it's a very, very bad line. I can't hear a word you're saying, so you come tomorrow.
Churchill relived Marlborough's great military campaigns.
He moved without noticing, really, from the past to the present and back again.
Marlborough never fought a battle that he did not win, nor besieged a fortress that he did not take. He held a grand alliance together, no less by his diplomacy than by his victories. He preserved by his genius the liberties of England and of Europe against tyranny.
It's a classic example of aristocratic ancestor worship. Part of Churchill's motive in doing that is to rehabilitate him from the Victorian view that he was an adventurer, that he was unprincipled, that he liked power and liked money. Another thing that he's doing, by implication, of course, is to defend himself, that is Churchill, from similar attacks about him.
But his study of Marlborough also taught Churchill vital strategic lessons for his own day.
It was a continuous thread right through his interpretation of British history that Britain could not fight a European war alone. There would always have to be allies.
In the early 1930s, Churchill brooded on the danger of a future European war caused by the rise of Nazi power in Germany. Randolph, his son, now a journalist, had already reported on the menace of Hitler.
My father was alongside him, traveling in his tri-motor Ford plane for the election campaign that was underway in Germany. And he witnessed Hitler's arrival in the stadium and all the Nazi stormtroopers doing their Sieg Heil. And it was in the course of those articles that quite categorically my father, and he was the first person in public life to do this, stated the rise to power of Hitler in Germany means war inevitably between Britain and Germany.
Churchill picked up this theme. Germany, he warned, was illegally rearming and would soon be equal in strength to Britain. The government must immediately increase its defenses to meet this threat.
There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtue, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride. Now they are rearming with the utmost speed. And ready to their hands is this new lamentable weapon of the air, before which women and children, the weak and frail, the warrior and the civilian, the frontline trenches and the cottage home, all lie in equal and impartial peril.
Inside Churchill, Churchill received a stream of visitors who brought him secret intelligence about Britain's weakness and Germany's growing ambitions. He also quizzed Clemmie's cousin, Diana Moseley, who knew Hitler well.
I was invited to luncheon by the Churchills because he wanted to hear about Hitler. And I said, you must meet him. It would fascinate you. You certainly should go to that. Oh, no, he said. He'd already made his mind up. There was to be no question.
Even in lighter moods, he dwelt on the Nazi peril.
He'd been given the black swans, which he took enormous pleasure in. But once a year, Emden geese would fly over and land on the lake. And one year, they arrived in the middle of lunch. And there was a roar, because Winston would face the window so he could see out. He would say, the Nazis have arrived. And I think there were some guests there, and we were all ordered to take up our pitchforks or knives and things and rush down the garden in the middle of lunch. I mean, they were interrupted to drive off the Nazis.
Churchill seemed to be obsessed by the Nazis. And once again, his violent rhetoric alienated many who might have listened to him.
He really debased the language of alarmism by depicting Gandhi, for example, as such an evil, sinister figure. When it came to then describing Hitler or Mussolini, who were genuinely sinister, particularly Hitler, people didn't believe him.
Then came the first clear sign that Churchill might be right. Hitler invaded the Rhineland in violation of international treaties. Churchill's voice began to be heeded by his own party.
The pavilion at Bournemouth, scene of a National Conservative annual conference. The Tories are concerned about the state of Britain's defences and show their sympathy with the views of Mr. Winston Churchill, one of the chief advocates of increasing the armed forces of the Crown, here seen with his son Randolph.
Churchill had forced concessions from the cabinet, and the Chancellor, Neville Chamberlain, pledged to increase armaments.
And to see the gaps in our defences filled at the earliest possible moment.
Though the message of rearmament began to be accepted, the messenger was not. When Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937, he too excluded Churchill from office. Churchill was again at odds with Chamberlain when the Nazis threatened to invade Czechoslovakia. War loomed, and the country waited anxiously. Believing that Hitler could be bought off, Chamberlain flew to negotiate a deal to carve up Czechoslovakia. The agreement signed at Munich was welcomed in Britain, for it preserved the peace. Churchill denounced it as an unmitigated defeat. As Hitler entered German-speaking Czechoslovakia, Churchill condemned those leaders who had thrown a small nation to the wolves. Churchill was at the lowest point in his political fortunes. He was also in deep financial trouble with huge debts, and his main newspaper contract cancelled because of his unpopular political views. Chartwell might have been sold if a financier friend had not come to the rescue. In conflict with his party, Churchill was now seen as an obstacle to peace by leaders like Lord Halifax, who championed appeasement.
People such as Lord Halifax's Foreign Secretary took the view that Winston was imperiling the possibility of his improving on any understanding with Hitler, because Hitler resented Winston and made it very clear that he resented him.
The Conservatives even tried to remove Churchill from his seat in Parliament.
The party as a whole felt enough was enough, that they'd had enough of him. And all sorts of rumours began to circulate, including rumours about his private life and his drinking, and we now know from the archives that these came from even as high as Conservative Central Office.
Central Office was, in fact, trying to persuade the local association that Churchill must at least be silenced. I think they'd have been happy with that, not with deselection necessarily.
Churchill survived a hostile motion by only 6 votes. But he always shrugged off suggestions that he should abandon active politics and retire.
Of those elder statesmen, to whose ranks quite a number of persons are anxious to promote me, and which I believe I may attain ultimately if I am good.
When the Germans occupied Prague, Churchill was proved right. Hitler could not be stopped by appeasement. A campaign to get Churchill back into government began with the support of leading newspapers. But Chamberlain continued to keep him out, despite the pressure. Then, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain could no longer avoid war with Germany. And Churchill could no longer be excluded from government. He was made First Lord of the Admiralty. After years of isolation, Churchill was now the most influential and visible member of the government.
The First Lord of the Admiralty is very much the guest of honor at his son's wedding. And here comes the bride, the Honourable Pamela Digby, age 19. The bridegroom, Mr. Randolph Churchill, is with his regiment. So it's swords and smiles. And the bride is having quite a lot of trouble with that feather.
Randolph had rushed into marriage with Pamela Digby after a courtship of only 2 weeks. He was determined to carry on the family line before the fighting started. It could not start too soon for Winston. He planned to send a task force to block off Norway from the Germans. But the enemy beat him to it, and the whole campaign was a costly failure. Parliament blamed Chamberlain, not Churchill, for the Norway defeat. In the political crisis that followed, Chamberlain proposed a coalition government, but the Labour Party refused to serve under him. Lord Halifax shrank from the leadership. Churchill seemed the man of the hour.
He did appear to be a man who knew about how to fight a war. He knew about grand strategy. He wanted to defeat Hitler. He was a man who had seen earlier than most that Hitler was evil. So in many ways, he was better qualified for the job, even though at the same time, there were many people who were really horrified at the thought of this wayward and unstable man taking over.
Goodbye, Mr. Chamberlain, and thanks for all you've tried to do. We welcome the new Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill.
He always realized that there was some great destiny awaiting him in the future. And it always looked as if it was about to happen, and it never did. And then finally, in 1940, the moment of destiny came.
as the Nazis look out tonight from their blatant, clattering, panoplied Germany, they cannot find one single friendly eye in the whole circumference of the globe. Not one.
In May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk, where it was trapped by the advancing Germans. Churchill had been Prime Minister for less than 3 weeks. Now Britain stood alone. Churchill had nothing to hurl at the enemy, save words of defiance.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Churchill represented the feelings of the overwhelming mass of the British people then better than anybody else, and he put it in magnificent language.
He had one astonishing quality, and that was to arouse instinctive and immediate enthusiasm. He never actually saw people at all. I mean, he never took a bus in his life. He would have a car, which would be chauffeur-driven, but he had the instinct of people en masse.
Invasion was now a real possibility.
It was pretty obvious that if Hitler had invaded England, the first people to disappear would be the Churchills. And he told us in all seriousness that if the Germans land, then if you only have the kitchen knife, use it. And if you account for one German, that will be, you've done your duty.
Always eager to attack, Churchill did not neglect defense. He moved his headquarters into underground premises at Storey's Gate, near Downing Street. Here he organized himself for war, drilling his army of assistants and secretaries to fall in with his extraordinary habits of work.
He worked almost 24 hours a day with 1 or 2 catnaps in between. That terrifying little telephone bell would go a few minutes after 8 when the day began. One might work up all day, take it in turns, or having more of us to share the task during the day, until evening time, quick lunch, evening meal, and then 2 of us, or possibly 3, would be on duty after dinner, and he would restart the day almost. I mean, just start working anew.
He's always maintained, you know, that this afternoon nap was crucial. Because it was very awkward for other people, because nobody else could have a nap. But it was an example of saying, I'm a man who everything is subordinate to my requirements.
He came down to the office about 11:30, and then I heard, and then he started. And off he went. And the words flowed out. And I wrote and wrote. And after a long time, he turned round on me and he said, "Are you tired?" And I said, "No, no, I'm not tired." And he said, "We must go on and on like the gun horses till we drop."
Churchill always liked to be at the heart of the conflict, and as the Battle of Britain reached its crucial climax, he took his daughter-in-law, Pamela, to watch the aerial struggle unfold in the Central Operations Room of Fighter Command.
It was very frightening because you saw the wave of the Luftwaffe coming over. You saw the air squadrons going up to meet them, the intense battle that took place. You saw gradually all these bulbs which indicated the aircraft base going dark. They went dark when there was no more aircraft to come up. And suddenly, they were all dark. If the Luftwaffe had spent another wave of bombers across to England, at that moment, there was no aircraft left to go up and intercept them. Winston sat there, and it was as if he'd personally rebuffed the German bombers.
Churchill's courage seemed contagious as the Blitz intensified.
At the height of the bombing in London, when I was with Winston, I had no fear at all, and I was convinced that nothing could possibly happen. He would walk through the streets, he would go up to the roof at Downing Street in order to look what he called the fireworks. Directly I left his presence, then I got a little bit frightened and would dive for shelter.
The Prime Minister made frequent and well-publicized visits to the bombed cities. His presence helped to keep up national morale. Clemmie was often by his side, and the rest of the family were mobilized. Sarah joined photographic reconnaissance. Mary worked with an anti-aircraft battery.
My papa was touchingly thrilled in the slow upward rise of his soldier daughter. And when my battery was in London, in Hyde Park, somebody who was dining with him one night said, "Your father suddenly said, 'Ooh, there's an air raid. Let's go and watch Mary's battery in action.' Whereupon he leapt into the car and came to the battery and sat puffing a cigar under a large notice saying no smoking, which embarrassed me appallingly, but nobody else seemed to mind very much.
Looking for action in the front line, Randolph was posted to Egypt, where he joined the long-range desert group. Back at home, his wife Pamela gave birth to a son, young Winston.
I knew it was very important for Winston to have a grandson, and he, of course, came up and saw it at every possible moment, and I remember him looking at the child and saying, poor kitten, a terrible world to be born into."
He had reason to be despondent. Rommel in North Africa had driven British forces back after their earlier successes. For months, the British Empire fought alone as Hitler and his allies extended their tyranny.
It is upon this foundation that Hitler, with his tattered lackey Mussolini at his tail and Admiral Darlan frisking at his side, pretends to build out of hatred, appetite, and racial assertion a new order for Europe.
The next victim of Hitler's new order was the Soviet Union. As the German armies advanced, Churchill found a new ally against Hitler.
So now this bloodthirsty gutter snipe must launch his mechanized armies upon new fields of slaughter, pillage, and devastation. Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and to the Russian people.
Clementine gave her personal support to the popular campaign to aid Russia.
The people of Russia have set up a new standard of courage and of endurance in the terrible sufferings through which they are going. In my humble way, I will do all I can. And I wish to repeat that I am proud to have been invited by the Red Cross in St. John to help them in this appeal.
The Aid to Russia Fund occupied Clemmie for much of the war and helped to strengthen the Anglo-Soviet alliance. The ally Churchill really sought was America. Harry Hopkins, personal representative of President Roosevelt, was sent to Britain along with Special Envoy Averell Harriman. These were friendly gestures. But American public opinion, hostile to war, restricted Roosevelt's freedom of action. In a secret correspondence, which he had conducted since 1939, Churchill pleaded for aid.
Most secret and personal, President Roosevelt from former naval person. I trust you realize, Mr. President, that the voice and force of the United States may count for nothing if they are withheld too long. They have a completely subjugated, Nazified Europe established with astonishing swiftness, and the weight may be more than we can bear. We must ask, therefore, as a matter of life and death, to be reinforced with these destroyers.
When negotiations began to try to claw out of the Americans some military help and some destroyers and some ammunition, the Americans made it very difficult. They made every stage of the negotiation difficult. And Churchill became very frustrated and personally very bitter.
Churchill did have one diplomatic success. In August 1941, he arranged a secret meeting off Newfoundland with the president. Churchill had high expectations of this encounter. It was presented as harmonious, but the unity was mainly symbolic.
Psychologically, I think it made people think in terms of us together. It was a very, very excellent PR move, especially on Churchill's part.
The Americans still showed no signs of entering the war. Then, at Chequers on the night of the 7th of December 1941, everything changed. The Churchill family were dining with the new American ambassador, Gil Wynant, Special Envoy Averell Harriman, and Harriman's daughter, Kathleen.
The war was not going well, and a lot of them at the time, he sat, and I was sitting next to him with his head in his hands. At 9 o'clock, Sawyers, his butler, came in with this little radio with a flip top.
And we listened to the news. And it wasn't till towards the end of the news that suddenly there was an interruption saying there's been word of the bombing of, and nobody quite got it. In fact, Tommy Thompson, the naval aide who was at dinner, said Pearl River, but Averell Harriman said, no, I think it was Pearl Harbor. And at that moment, one of the secretaries came in to say that the Admiralty had confirmed that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. So Winston, accompanied by Harriman and Wynant, went out of the room saying, I must immediately place a call to President Roosevelt. And I gather that in that conversation he said, we are now both in this together. And I will go to the House of Commons on Monday and declare war on Japan.
For the first time in the war, Churchill knew that he held a winning hand. Confident of ultimate victory, Churchill was in Washington within 3 weeks of Pearl Harbor. Germany had declared war on the United States, and the Allies had to plan grand strategy. Churchill impressed his own personality on his mother's native land.
I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American,
and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own.
But there were tensions behind the good humor.
Oh, no. When Churchill came to the White House, everything was turned upside down. It was mostly a shock to my grandmother. He tended to sleep in the mornings. He tended not to go to bed till very late. He had a nap every afternoon, and FDR never had a nap. And then would sit up with Churchill late at night. And she saw the toll this was taking on FDR. But FDR enjoyed it. He enjoyed it very much. And in fact, I think it really is part of that rapport. They didn't sit up doing policy. They were sitting up telling stories and exchanging things. But at the same time, woven in and out of the jokes were perceptions of how policy would proceed.
And how to conduct the war. The Americans wanted to open a second front against Hitler in Northern Europe. But Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to concentrate first on the Mediterranean and mount a joint invasion of North Africa, despite the misgivings of the American military.
We knew he was a canny, wily devil, a manipulator. He was the first to admit that himself. We knew about his faults, but there was still something about him. What he had stood for, that touched us. He could pull out humor, pathos. He was a terrifically persuasive fellow.
Churchill's arts of persuasion were severely tested when he journeyed to Moscow to see Stalin with Averell Harriman, President Roosevelt's representative, to tell the Soviet leaders that there would be no second front in France in 1942. They had urgently demanded an invasion of Europe to take the pressure off the beleaguered Russians. Stalin was furious and accused Churchill of cowardice. Churchill responded emphatically.
He was annoyed and he lost his temper, and he started talking about Britain and himself and what they'd done during the war, and his poor interpreter, Major Burse, just gave up trying to keep out with this torrent of words. And Stalin said through his interpreter, "It's not necessary. I know what he said."
Churchill went straight from Moscow to North Africa to confer with his commanders. The British had been badly mauled by Rommel in the desert with heavy losses. It was time to reshuffle the generals and make a fresh start.
Churchill was extremely tough with those who commanded in the desert. There's no doubt about it. He was ruthless, and rightly ruthless, with lack of drive, lack of oomph in the desert war.
He put General Montgomery in charge of the whole campaign. Then he turned to what he did best, boosting morale among the troops. In October, the British 8th Army pushed across the desert and broke Rommel at El Alamein, opening up the whole North African coast. It was the first major British victory of the war, and the last they would win alone. It was the victory Churchill had waited for, and he exulted in the moment.
Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Later, during this visit, we were only there a few days, He said, I want to sail round the harbour, which was full of ships that had been sunk. So I remember getting in this small boat with him, and we were going in and out of the ships, which was just below the water or just sticking up in odd angles, and he loved it. It appealed to him enormously.
Churchill relished the drama and the details of warfare. As plans were laid for the invasion of Italy and later France, he intervened in every operation. The chiefs of staff were worn down. The greatest burden fell on Sir Alan Brooke.
Alan Brooke was constantly irritated by Churchill. A lot of Alan Brooke's time was spent dissuading from Churchill from undertaking operations which he could see would fail or were pointless or a waste of resources.
He never faces realities. At one moment we are reducing our forces, and the next we are invading the continent with vast armies for which there is no hope of ever finding the shipping. He is quite incorrigible, and I am quite exhausted.
His lack of grasp sometimes dismayed junior officers actually engaged in the fighting.
He did talk a lot of rot about the strategic aspect. For example, he described Italy as a soft underbelly of Europe. In fact, it was a very spiky spine, because the fighting there was probably the most exhausting of any campaign in the war. So we didn't really, in that sense, trust his judgment.
One can depict Churchill as an infuriating military amateur, blundering around and upsetting people unnecessarily. Or you can take another view and say that he was the essential goad, the risk-taker, recognizing that in war you have to take risks. The war itself is a gamble.
In the end, Churchill never overruled his generals. And he now had to defer to his American allies. With their greater resources, they increasingly took over the planning and operation of the war. The Allies met for the first time with Stalin at Tehran in 1943. The Big Three talked strategy, but played power politics. The close relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt changed.
President Roosevelt got it into his head that he and he alone could deal with Stalin. And so at the Tehran conference, he publicly, rather, made up to Stalin and rather snubbed Winston Churchill.
At dinner, Stalin made a proposal or a toast. The first thing that the Allies should do after victory was to line up 50,000 top-ranking German officers and shoot them all. Well, of course, that violated Churchill's sense of right, and he got terribly upset. Roosevelt chimed in. He chimed in trying to make a joke, but he said, oh, well, let's reduce it to 49,000. Churchill, angry, goes out in the next room and won't rejoin the dinner until Stalin himself went out and reassured him that he was only joking.
There I sat, with the great Russian bear on one side of me, and on the other side, the great American buffalo. And between the two sat the poor little English donkey, who was the only one who knew the right way home.
In the winter of 1943, Churchill entered his 70th year. Worried about the strain of his incessant traveling, his daughters watched over him throughout the war. He had heart spasms and then pneumonia.
He was working far too hard and far too many hours per day. He used to smoke excessively cigars, and he was very ill in Carthage. He had pneumonia. You know, I had my doubts whether he was going to recover.
Yesterday morning, just before my arrival, because he felt well again, he was as happy as a lark and began to smoke again, which of course is wrong. He's gaining strength every day, but very slowly indeed.
Within days of his illness, he had resumed control of the war effort. Sarah and his son Randolph were with him.
Randolph came out. He wanted to fight. He was very courageous, and he got himself attached to an armored regiment. But when there wasn't any fighting, he came back and was rather a nuisance.
If he were coming to one of our conferences, my heart sank, because he always seemed to upset his father over something. And they were very close, but just they didn't work together.
The sort of thing that Randolph did was to tell his father how to reshuffle his government, or to get rid of him and put him in his place.
It got to the point where they would have such humdingers of rows that my grandmother banned my father at one stage from 10 Downing Street during the war, because she was frightened that it would give my grandfather a heart attack.
Shunned in Downing Street, Randolph sought action in Yugoslavia. Communist partisans had tied down the Germans in the mountains. Randolph joined a British military mission and was parachuted in to support them. The arrival of Churchill's son impressed the partisan leader, Tito, but caused problems for his own commanding officer, Brigadier Fitzroy MacLean.
Churchill had said to me, you can have anybody in the British Army, Navy or Air Force you want, and I picked what I think was a wonderful team. It didn't stop Randolph saying to me, I'm sorry to have to tell you, Brigadier, that your other officers are neither my social nor my intellectual equals. I thought this was in the middle of a German offensive. Everything was going wrong. And I thought how absolutely intolerable. But I said, thank you for telling me that, Randolph. I can't do anything about it now at this moment, but I bear it in mind.
The Allies were now everywhere on the attack. From their Normandy bridgehead, the American and British armies battered the Germans across France. Churchill left for what would be his last joint meeting with Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta, knowing that an end to the conflict would not be long delayed. But he now had a weaker hand to play.
Churchill probably went to Yalta in an optimistic frame of mind, but he became depressed during the course of the conference. It became obvious to him that it wasn't now a big 3, it was a big 2.5. He was the half. He saw Roosevelt and Stalin agreeing on things which Churchill felt inimical to British interests, or inimical to the vision of the world which he wanted, and that pained him greatly, I think.
Stalin was unyielding. Wherever the Red Army had advanced, the Soviets would be a dominant influence. Roosevelt was in no state to resist. He had only 2 months to live. Churchill was full of foreboding.
I don't think he had many illusions, and he used to say at times in committee, we shall end with the barbarians in the heart of Europe, which was exactly what we did.
For now, the Russians were still allies, as Churchill rode with his armies into the ruins of Hitler's Reich. He had achieved his principal aim, victory at all costs. Victory was near. The cost was still to be counted.
The Churchills continues next week. Sunday night, we profile a giant of the post-war classical music world. Join us for Herbert von Karajan, Sunday night at 9:20. And stay with us now for Late Line.
For an entertaining and
He was essentially a very emotional man. And I always remember one occasion after he'd retired at Churchill, and he was playing old gramophone records of military marches, the soldiers of the Queen. And Mrs. Churchill and my wife were chattering. And he suddenly turned on them and said, "You silly women, stop chattering like that. You don't know what this means to me," and burst into tears.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
May the 8th, 1945, VE Day. After nearly 6 years of war, victory in Europe was a reality. Winston Churchill could hardly savor the moment. The coalition government he had led was about to dissolve. Until elections took place on July the 5th, Churchill would lead a caretaker government. He would attend to the building of peace in Europe and to the waging of war on Japan, while fighting a campaign to win an election at home.
Well, he did a tour of the whole country, and Preston was a convenient stopping place for him to make a speech. We took him through the little villages and towns to Preston itself, where there was a crowd of 20,000. I've never seen such a crowd in England, waiting in the main square outside the public library. It was an extraordinary cavalcade. The people came out and cheered. Cripples came out with the Union Jack on their crutches, all madly pro-Winston.
Nobody who had seen what I have seen could have any doubt as to the outcome of the elections, Churchill told a friend. But campaigning at Winston's side, Clementine harbored doubts. 4 or 5 rows back, she remarked, there were watchful, even hostile faces.
There was a lot of feeling in the forces and in the factories that we wanted to make a fresh start, that we were not happy with the Depression years, that we were not happy with the times of unemployment, and that we ought to be trying to make a new start.
There was a long background in the 30s of extreme poverty, very high unemployment, all under a coalition government which had been predominantly conservative. And the feeling was that if the Tories got back, it would mean reversion to many of the miseries of the 30s.
More than 350,000 families in England and Wales are living in insanitary and crowded homes like these. In London alone, 70,000 families, often many in a bed.
Churchill could have improved his party's image by endorsing the Beveridge Report, a popular plan calling on government to create a welfare state.
We must strive to give everybody greater security against poverty, unemployment, sickness, and old age.
Churchill hesitantly echoed the demands for reform. But his vague promises fell short of a commitment and were overshadowed by his belligerent attacks against his former allies in the Labour Party.
No socialist system can be established without a political police. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo.
The country had seen a good war victory run by Churchill and his colleagues in the cabinet, Ernest Bevin and Attlee and the others, who'd been sitting there helping to win the war. And although Churchill had played the most prominent part in that, nobody could deny that, some of his colleagues there had played a very big part too. And for Churchill to come out then the next day, week or so, and talk as if Mr. Attlee was going to start to run a Nazi Gestapo, well, it was ludicrous.
We laughed at it because here was little Attlee, who Beaverbrook said when he was in cabinet, never said anything but yes sir, yes sir, yes sir to Churchill all the time, apparently going to organise a Gestapo. Well, it was ludicrous, of course, nobody believed it at all. It was a terrible gaffe.
On July the 5th, scarcely 2 months after VE Day, Britain went to the polls. It would take 3 weeks for the results to be announced, to allow for the counting of ballots cast by soldiers fighting the Japanese as far away as Burma. Declaration Day, July the 26th.
Electors at Mr. Churchill's constituency, Woodford.
Mary and Clementine Churchill attended the vote count at Churchill's constituency. An independent candidate had come forward as the Labour and Liberal parties had refrained from challenging Churchill.
The one candidate who was standing was a sort of unknown crackpot. And as we came out of the count, my mother said, "This bodes very badly." So I said, well, my father had a big majority. She said, yes, but that man never ought to have got that number of votes. We must hurry home. We must get the news. And as we came back into the annex, I have to explain that the map room had been turned into a room where my father could sit and receive the results of the election. And as we came up the steps, I remember so well his private secretary, Jock Colville, coming down with a face of absolute gloom and said to my mother, "It's a debacle. It's like 1906.
Clement Attlee's Labour Party had won the 1945 elections in a landslide. For Winston Churchill, who had led Britain through its darkest hours, it was a bitter defeat.
We all repaired, rather tail between legs, to Chequers for a last weekend. We were mostly family, and it was not a very happy weekend. We played gramophone records for my father. It was beginning to enter really into him, the great sort of personal humiliation side of it.
At the end of the weekend, the Churchill family signed the visitors' book at Chequers. Winston signed last. Under his name, he wrote, "Finis." Clementine bore the burden of defeat. She wrote to her daughter Mary,
I am finding life more than I can bear. He is so unhappy, and that makes him very difficult. In our misery, we seem, instead of clinging to each other, to be always having scenes.
Churchill's favourite daughter, Sarah, joined her father for a painting holiday at Lake Como, Italy. 2 days after arriving, she wrote to her mother,
He's going to start a new picture today. I really think he is settling down. He said last night, I've had a happy day. I haven't heard that for I don't know how long.
Rising above his depression, Churchill turned his thoughts to Europe. In the closing months of the war, Churchill had grown increasingly worried about Joseph Stalin. As Stalin imposed communist rule on the nations of Eastern Europe, Churchill's worst fears were realized. In March 1946, at the invitation of US President Harry Truman, Churchill spoke at the University of Missouri in Fulton.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. From what I have seen of our Russian friends, I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength.
It was a wake-up call and made a lot of Americans realize for the first time the problems we were facing with the Soviet Union. Nobody else other than Churchill would have had that impact. No American speaking would have had the impact that Churchill did at that point, simply because of the enormous regard that the American people had for Winston Churchill.
It's the same wherever he goes. His appearance in Copenhagen draws enormous Danish crowds. To the nations of Europe, he represents the Britain of their trust. In France,
the war-torn nations of the continent again looked to Churchill for leadership. But he only gave rhetorical support to the idea of a united Europe.
We hope to see a Europe where men of every country will think as much of being a European as of belonging to their native land.
Churchill thought Europe ought to unite, but like many English people, he thought that Europe stopped at the Channel. And he disappointed, disillusioned many of his supporters in Europe when, having proposed that there should be a European army, he made it clear that Britain shouldn't be part of it. And I will never forget him making this clear when he spoke at Strasbourg in 1949. The sense of being let down was absolutely palpable.
At home in Chartwell, Churchill's attention shifted from moulding the future to shaping the past. In his study, he began to write his wartime memoirs. Intended as a personal account, Churchill's recollections remained for many years the definitive history of World War II.
He took away with him all of his official papers, which he used in that 6-volume history, in a way that no one else was able to do, because these papers, apart from Churchill using them, went into the archives and were not going to be made available for the next best part of half a century. So Churchill, in a way, had a kind of monopoly on the interpretation and the history of the Second World War.
Published in every major language, Churchill's history won him a Nobel Prize for Literature and made him a rich man. Freed from a lifetime of financial difficulty, Winston could now provide for the future of his growing family.
To those with enough leg power to get them to Westerham in Kent, the parish church presents an interesting scene. The month-old son of Mrs. Christopher Soames, Mary Churchill, is christened Arthur Nicholas Winston. Chartwell Farm, home of Captain and Mrs. Soames, is the scene of the christening party. Doing the honours with the christening cake is young Winston, son of Randolph Churchill.
I would have been 5 or 6 years of age when I first went to Chartwell. And I well remember going in to see him in his bedroom about 9 or 9:30 in the morning, and through wreaths of cigar smoke, one would see the venerable grandpapa tucked up in bed, who would be peering at one over his half gold-rimmed spectacles, puffing away at his cigar, dictating to a secretary. Anyway, on my arrival, he would dismiss the secretary and say, "Now, Winston, what shall we do today?" And there were certain things that were inevitably on the agenda, like visiting the Golden Orf, his wonderful huge goldfish, and the black swans, which are the gift of the Australian government. And then we would end up in the farmyard where he would get his walking stick and scratch the backs of the pigs. He had great empathy with the pigs, and he said to me, "Winston, always remember that a cat looks down on man, a dog looks up to man, but a pig will look you in the eye and see his equal.
Much as it had been in the 1930s, Churchill was the hub of Churchill family life. Visitors included Churchill's oldest daughter, Diana, and her husband, Duncan Sands, and Randolph Churchill. But the family was changing. Christopher Soames had become a substitute son for Winston.
When we first married, he managed the farms for my father, and they became very close. And all sorts of things that Christopher was interested in, Papa had forgotten he was interested in. For instance, he bought a little tiny stud not far from here and bred some quite famous horses, High Hat and Vienna. And he and Christopher used to go off. Mummy and I were deeply bored by racing, and so the two boys used to go off and have a lovely time at the races together.
While Christopher became Winston's closest companion, his own son, Randolph, was a growing embarrassment. The years after the war had been a letdown for Randolph. He'd lost his seat in Parliament and divorced Pamela Churchill. Neither his marriage to June Osborne nor the birth of their daughter Arabella had succeeded in taming Randolph.
It was rather like walking around hand in hand with a volcano. You never knew when, out of a clear blue sky, there wouldn't be the most monumental eruption, particularly if he had had one or two glasses of whiskey.
He could be terribly rude to waiters. And I said, well, no, you oughtn't to do this. And he said, well, it makes no difference. I'm equally rude to dukes. I say what comes into my mind.
Several people claim to be the person who first said, there is no more frightening phrase, except perhaps war has been declared, than the phrase, Randolph Churchill has just arrived at the party. Because as soon as he came in, there he was, you know, insulting people, upbraiding people, asking them questions, and the whole sort of disturbance ran through the party. You could chart his movement.
Interest centred on the West Country citadel, Devonport.
Randolph soon seized an opportunity to revive his fortunes. In the 1950 general election, he stood for Parliament at Plymouth, Devonport.
Conservative candidate was Randolph Churchill, Winston's only son, former MP for Preston, and wartime paratrooper. His opponent was Michael Foote, socialist son of the Liberals' elder statesman Isaac Foote.
Randolph was a very old-fashioned, wonderful electioneer. He would hurl everything at you, and that was the tradition in which he'd been brought up.
At Devonport, Randolph fought a good fight, but he stopped short of doing what was needed to win a fierce election.
The idea of canvassing, knocking at a door and saying, will you vote Tory, was absolutely alien to his way of thinking, you know. I mean, he hated the Conservatives there because they wanted him to knock at doors and say, may I have your vote, please? This was completely beneath his dignity.
I recognize our opponents are also opposed to the communists. Thanks, mate. We are opposed to communists and to fascists. Here, here. We want our parliamentary...
Churchill brought the Conservatives to the threshold of victory in 1950. But his shaky performance convinced many people, including prominent Tories, that he was too old and out of touch to continue leading the party.
As well as all those things which divide us. And to set the people free. If I have to say a word, where's your policy?
Ever his own man, Winston ignored their concerns and determined to stay on. Remarkable pertinacity, said Randolph, who had lost to Michael Foote at Devonport. 99 out of 100 people would have cleared out, but not he.
Outside St. Stephen's Hall, Kensington, there's a huge crowd as Mr. Churchill comes to do his duty.
In less than 2 years, Churchill was back, leading his party in yet another election.
Now voting is over and the count begins.
This time it was victory for the Conservatives and for the Churchills. Winston's sons-in-law, Duncan Sands and Christopher Soames, were elected to Parliament. Only Randolph failed to win a seat. The next morning, the family celebrated.
Champagne was poured and passed around, and Churchill put his hand down, knowing full well that the dog was there. And he said, My dear Rufus, we shall now be going back to number 10 Downing Street. You are a lucky dog.
There may be a lull in our party strife, which will enable us to understand more of what is good in our opponents and not to be so very clever at finding out all their shortcomings.
On the day he became Prime Minister for the second time, Churchill was just short of his 77th birthday. It had been a punishing campaign, and Winston was exhausted. It will be uphill work, remarked Clementine, but he has an eager, willing heart.
I think she was uneasy about his health, distinctly uneasy. In many ways, I think she didn't want him to become Prime Minister for the second time. I think she'd in many ways preferred that he did not do so.
She was tired by then, and the thought of struggling back into Downing Street, and, you know, she supported him loyally, but her heart was not in it. She thought he oughtn't to have gone on.
He was far past his best. He could still make brilliant jokes, and he was still the one politician who had poetry and vision in the Parliament of his time, and from that point of view he was interesting, but he'd ceased to pay close attention to what was going on.
Being around at that time, I mean, I think one did realize that Winston wasn't certainly at the height of his powers. But there was still this feeling that, rather like a volcano, that at a certain point with a certain challenge, he could produce an incandescence as nobody else could.
Now comes the first cabinet meeting. Captain Cruikshank is the new health minister and deputy leader of the House. Wartime expert Lord Leathers will supervise fuel, power and transport.
Churchill filled his cabinet with old friends and gave them a free hand in the details of administration. But it was he who set the tone.
If you were to ask what was the principal theme of Churchill's government at home after 1951, it was the search for a quiet life. He wanted life to be peaceful at home so that he could pursue his great objective of détente with the Soviet Union.
Churchill appointed Anthony Eden to head the Foreign Office. Widely regarded as Winston's successor, Eden had stood with Churchill since the late 1930s. His marriage to Churchill's niece Clarissa in 1952 cemented an already close relationship.
People do say that it was rather like a father and son, and I think that maybe is where the sort of bad blood came in, you know, from people like Randolph, really.
Randolph envied Anthony Eden's position as Crown Prince. His blustering attacks on Eden created tensions in the family.
Before I married, Randolph was the cousin whom I was in a way closest to. It was difficult, of course, after I married, because I couldn't really speak to him at all.
Eden was the victim of Randolph's outspoken attacks, but it was Christopher Soames, Churchill's parliamentary secretary and confidant, who was the object of his consuming jealousy. Randolph felt rejected by his father. Deeply wounded, he wrote Winston an anguished letter, 15 pages long.
My dear Papa, it has been a growing source of grief to me that ever since you became Prime Minister, you no longer have the same desire for my company. I realize, too, that you regard me as a failure, and that you cannot disguise this view entirely successfully from other people. In one thing, I have never changed or faltered: my absolute love, devotion, and loyalty to you.
Relations between the two men improved that Christmas, when Winston gave his son what Randolph himself called a princely son. In June, all three Churchills took part in the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II.
I was page to Peter Portal, who was Chief of the Air Staff during the war, and my father was a silver stick in waiting, whatever that may be. And my grandfather was there in his coronation robes as Prime Minister, and I had occasion to walk very close to Her Majesty, and she was radiantly beautiful, and I can well understand how my grandfather was head over heels in love with her.
The coronation of Elizabeth II resonated with the greatness of Britain's past, an age of empire now gone forever.
The fact was that Britain's power was visibly waning, and one of the things that Churchill most wanted to try to do was either to deny that this was so, or at least to try to defy the fact that it was so, and to present himself as the great leader of what was still a great nation that seriously mattered in what was, in fact, of course, a bipolar world dominated by Russia and by America.
The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 had given Churchill new hope of easing tensions with communist Russia. But Churchill saw more than a chance to end the Cold War. He saw an opportunity to enhance his influence in a dangerous nuclear world.
I think that he felt that Winston Churchill, was the man best qualified to try and bring some kind of decent settlement with the Soviet Union. He had this great man theory of history, you know, the saying that there's no such thing as history, there's only biography. And I think he believed that. And he'd always had a feeling that if leading figures got together, all would be well.
Churchill's enthusiasm for peace talks with the new Soviet leaders was not shared by Anthony Eden's Foreign Office. Starting with Eden himself, down to the ambassador in Moscow, Sir William Hayter.
Churchill thought he could talk to them. It was never very clear to me what he was going to talk to them about, or what he thought could be done in relationship with them. He just had the idea that he was the last survivor of the great three in the wartime, that he had a unique position somehow to influence them. I'm afraid he deluded himself about all that, but that was a delusion that he had rather strongly.
In April, Eden became gravely ill. Churchill seized the moment and launched his peace initiative. The first step was to gain the support of the new American president, Churchill's wartime friend and ally, Dwight Eisenhower. In a series of telegrams, Churchill tried to persuade Eisenhower to join him at a peace summit with the new Russian leaders.
There will be a strong movement here for a meeting between the heads of state and government. How do you stand about this? If nothing can be arranged, I shall have to consider seriously a personal contact.
Eisenhower agreed to meet Churchill that July in Bermuda to discuss the prospects of talks with Russia, bringing Churchill's dream of ending the Cold War one step closer to reality. On June the 23rd, in his last official engagement before leaving for Bermuda, Churchill hosted a dinner for the Italian Prime Minister, Alcide de Gasperi. At the end of the dinner, Churchill grew unsteady. His speech became slurred. The following afternoon, at Clementine's request, he was driven to Chartwell. When he arrived 2 hours later, the left side of his body was paralyzed. That weekend, it was thought that Churchill would die.
The doctors, Sir Russell Brain and Lord Moran, drafted a medical bulletin for the press, in which was mentioned that he'd had a circulatory problem. And to anybody who knew anything about it, that meant a stroke.
The Churchill family suppressed the bulletin. For the next 30 years, Churchill's stroke remained a closely guarded secret.
3 press barons, who were his close friends, I don't know how close they were to each other, but on this occasion they were close. Lord Camrose, principally, who was the Daily Telegraph, his very great personal friend, Brendan Bracken, and Lord Beaverbrook all arrived very soon at Chartwell over that weekend, and in some unique and extraordinary manner, they, for want of a better word, they gagged the press.
At first, the truth was concealed from the British people in order to buy time for Anthony Eden to recover from his third operation.
I think it was thought that Winston probably wouldn't survive, and that if Anthony had not been so desperately ill at that time, I presume that the transition would have probably taken place fairly soon. As it was, there was this sort of caretaker government set up.
The boxes arrived, I remember them piling up in the office, and slightly a feeling of how are we going to cope with this? And Christopher Soames and Jock Colwell sat down at the table in the office, and they just went through each piece of paper and dealt with it. And there was no problem.
I went to see Soames in his little office, which is next to the Prime Minister's office in the House of Commons. And while we were talking, his secretary came in and said, Lord Woolston's on the line. Oh, said Soames, all right, I'll talk to him. And then he said to me, and I heard him say to Lord Woolston, just hold on a minute, I'll go and ask the Prime Minister. I knew perfectly well the Prime Minister wasn't there. He came back and he said to Lord Woolston, I've consulted the Prime Minister, he would like you to do as follows. Which he made up. I mean, he made up his own Prime Minister's advice.
Christopher Soames did a lot of the signing when he was out for 3 or 4 months. Did a lot of the signing of the letters. Produced a wonderful Winston as Churchill signature. It amazes me looking back, of course, that it was kept a secret as it was.
There were no blabbing mouths and no long-distance lenses and no taped telephone calls. I think everybody's forgotten how to keep confidence.
Within the confines of Churchill, Churchill despaired. It is extraordinary that between night and morning I should go like this, a bundle of old rags, he said to a friend. But through the long days of summer, Churchill began to regain his health. Less than 2 months after his stroke, he felt well enough to reconsider his retirement. I don't think I shall commit myself when I see Anthony, he told his doctor. I don't like being kicked out until I've had a shot at settling this Russia business. Churchill set himself a test. The Conservative Party conference at Margate on October the 10th. If he could survive public scrutiny and deliver his address, he would remain Prime Minister. If not, he would resign in favour of the now recovered Anthony Eden.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mayor, my lords, ladies and gentlemen.
My goodness, we were worried about the speech he had to make at the Tory party conference. Beady eyes from all over the world, every camera trained, every political correspondent, binoculars, mental or otherwise. Agony. I thought my nails would go through my flesh.
5 months ago, on the 11th of May, I made a speech in the House of Commons. I have not spoken since. The first time in my political life that I've kept quiet for so long.
By a supreme act of will, Churchill survived his great test.
I have no intention of plunging the nation into electioneering strife this year. And indeed, so far as my immediate knowledge is concerned, that applies to next year too.
He would remain Prime Minister. And he would resume the quest for what he said he cared about most, the building of a sure and lasting peace.
Sir Winston comes slowly down the gangway. Neither the V sign nor the legendary cigar are in evidence today.
On December the 2nd, 1953, after a 6-month delay, Churchill arrived in Bermuda for his conference with President Eisenhower and the French Prime Minister. With him came a visibly unhappy Anthony Eden. road to Bermuda had been a hard road. But at last, Churchill's great moment had come. He might now be able to convince Eisenhower that Russia had changed and that the time was ripe for peace. At the very first meeting, Churchill stated his case. He was rudely rebuffed. Despite bath, perfume, or lace, Eisenhower said, Russia is the same old whore underneath.
Our meetings have reinforced our solidarity, strengthened our resolve, and fortified our...
Bermuda was portrayed as a big success, and Winston Churchill put on a brave face.
There was a sense of trying to keep the old man happy. And in point of fact, nothing was achieved at that conference. The French fell out because the Prime Minister got pneumonia, and as everything had to be interpreted, Churchill was getting very impatient, and no work was done. Everybody spent their time bathing and having midnight parties on the beach, and I think it was a very sad and disappointing occasion for Churchill.
Churchill emerged from Bermuda a diminished Prime Minister.
A lot of his cabinet were begging him to resign, although very few of them knew him well enough to dare to raise the issue, and they just couldn't separate him from power.
Eden, of course, was longing for Churchill to resign, and Churchill used to tease Eden by reminding him that Mr. Gladstone formed his last government at the age of 82. And he was teasing Eden all the time, and it made Eden very nervous and unhappy and miserable. There's no doubt about that.
Eden must have hoped that Churchill would use his 80th birthday to announce his retirement. But Churchill had come to accept tribute and a portrait by Graham Sutherland.
My parents were very nervous, and anyway, we all arrived. I was 8 years old, but can fully remember the tension and the worry that was going on about this portrait, because clearly everyone had discovered that it was not what you would call flattering.
On behalf of both Houses of Parliament, Prime Minister, I ask you to accept this portrait.
There was certainly a gasp in the hall when it was revealed, and my grandfather, and particularly my grandmother, were deeply offended. It was done in sickly shades of green and yellow. He's slumped in a chair. There's a hint of an undone fly button.
The portrait is a remarkable example of modern art.
My grandmother certainly felt that it was a calculated insult by the artist, and she got Mr. Vincent, the gardener, to put it on the bonfire at Churchill.
Clementine could spare Winston the pain of seeing himself through Sutherland's eyes, but she could not do away with the fact that it was time for him to go. On New Year's Day, 1955, Churchill resolved to retire. I feel like an aeroplane at the end of its flight, he said, in the dusk, with the petrol running out, in search of safe landing.
The time to go had come. And so, in April 1955, he went.
Eden finally had his chance. 2 years later, he was overwhelmed by Suez. Churchill was deeply distressed. He had devoted his life to preserving the greatness of the British Empire, and now he was powerless to prevent its demise.
He virtually withdrew. He had his house at Hyde Park Gate. He used to give little lunches and dinners. But he was getting increasingly deaf. And although they went on sending him the Foreign Office telegrams, he was getting out of touch, really, with what was happening in the world. He saw people occasionally, and the great days were over, and he knew they couldn't come back again.
try a few steps with me, please?
Oh, dear.
Can't you dance with a partner?
Well, I couldn't till a moment ago.
We'll try. We'll take something easy to start. May I have a pickup, please?
My Aunt Sarah was beautiful and used to appear suddenly with the most impractical sort of presence, sort of a practically glamorous nightdress or a bedside lamp in the shape of a cherub, the sort of things that we'd never have been given normally, but suddenly she would appear with these like a sort of fairy godmother.
At the height of her acting career, Sarah Churchill had achieved considerable success.
You can have dinner with me some night.
Well, I should love to.
How about tonight?
Well, I don't know.
She'll do fine. We'll pick you up at 8. Thank you. Who's next?
Sarah was one of the great, wonderful people in the world. I loved her. So did Sir Winston. We were within 1 or 2 years of the same age, and so he called us his dancing girls.
Sarah would join her father at La Pausa, a fabulous villa in the south of France, where Winston was the frequent guest of his literary agent, Emery Reeves, and his beautiful wife, Wendy, a former model and dancer.
He came here with such happiness to enjoy the sunshine, to enjoy the villa, to enjoy the great food, to enjoy the great wine cellar. I mean, Emery would give him cognac from 1825, and he loved that, of course.
Everything was there. He really didn't have to move a step if he didn't want to. And if he wanted caviar, then it was on the table and Wendy would feed him. And if he wanted a scotch and soda, then it was there by his side.
For more than 3 years, Winston enjoyed the hospitality of La Pausa. But Clementine came only once.
She wore her hair in very small little curls. And I said to her one day, "Oh, please, Lady Churchill, let me brush your curls out. I would love for you to come down to dinner tonight with your hair all brushed out." And she looks at me and she said, "Well, all right, brush." She hands me the brush. And so I brush her hair, and I tell you, she became so beautiful. She became really what Sir Winston always saw in her, a beautiful woman.
Lady Churchill, of course, was a very, very active person. She wanted always to be on the go, and if possible, to get Winston to come along with her. And when she saw that once he got to La Pausa, he was more or less anchored, I think she gave up. You know, she wasn't the person to sort of respond to a person who'd been a dancer. You know, she loved people of a certain standard or above.
Lady Churchill found fault with everything. Lady Churchill found fault with everything, with everybody. I mean, Sarah would bite her nails or pick them, and so her hands were not very pretty. She was ill-organized. Her hair was not always nice. She couldn't go near her mother. She was so afraid of the condemnation. She was never right. She never was what Lady Churchill wanted. She suffered from that.
Clementine's criticisms did not help Sarah cope with the demands of her glamorous yet troubled life. By the mid-1950s, her marriage to society photographer Anthony Beecham had failed. When Beecham committed suicide, Sarah's life descended in a spiral of drunkenness and scandal.
I did what I could to help, particularly in persuading her to undertake treatment. And she was quite willing, quite amenable, but it didn't work. And she'd said to me finally, I remember, "You're wasting your time, Anthony. Alcohol is part of my life." It was very sad. It was, her father felt it very acutely, and so did she.
Monte Carlo was delighted on the day before the golden wedding anniversary when Sir Winston and Lady Churchill paid a surprise visit with members of their family.
In September 1958, Randolph Churchill and his daughter Arabella joined Winston and Clementine on the day of their 50th wedding anniversary. With the passing of the years, father and son had found a new ease with one another. Using money from the Churchill Trust, Randolph had bought a house at East Bergholt, trading the excitement of London for the life of a country gentleman.
He had quite a staff there. He had an Italian butler. He had 2 maids. He had 2 secretaries. We had 2 secretaries that worked 12 hours on, 12 hours off round the clock, just in case, you know, an article or a bon mot should appear. They were ready to take it down.
Randolph had become one of the most successful journalists of his time, but his dream was to write Winston's biography, just as Winston had written that of his own father, Lord Randolph.
I think he only got it at the end after he'd written The Life of Lord Derby, which was just a very well-written book. And I remember being very excited. He came to see me and my mother in London and to tell us he got it, and he was thrilled to bits. And we built a special building out in the backyard, which was to hold all the archives. And the house actually became a business. The whole thing was a business, really. And every night there would be readings of what had been written so far. I think having the biography made him a lot happier. He had much more purpose. I mean, mind you, he'd always been an excellent journalist. He was a very good writer. But this is what he'd wanted for so long.
Randolph tried to lead a new life and to patch up old relationships, but he remained his own worst enemy.
On one occasion, for example, his mother came down to have a discussion about the biography. And I've never known him so careful and actually so nervous and so determined to make a good impression. And then suddenly, in the middle of lunch, or actually very early on in the lunch, something went wrong, and he was shouting and screaming at her. And with great dignity, she asked someone at the table to find out the time of the next train to London and to take her to the station.
Shortly after their golden wedding anniversary, Winston and Clementine left on the first of many cruises aboard Aristotle Onassis' yacht, the Christina.
Christina was a converted Canadian wartime frigate, big liner, big yacht, 1,850 tons. And he loved going on those cruises. The sun, the relaxation, the peace, because there was nobody surrounding him at all. Nobody came on board except when we arrived in ports, and then only by invitation. And Onassis lavished every attention he could possibly imagine on him.
No effort was spared aboard the Christina to try to stir the old man out of a deep melancholia that had settled over him.
He became dreadfully deaf, very seriously deaf. And in a buzz of conversation, he couldn't hear anything anybody was saying, and therefore fell silent and took no part. I don't think you would ever call him senile in the proper, full medical sense of the term. I don't think that was so. But he was withdrawn, he was dreadfully deaf, and he was very depressed.
Only weeks after returning from his last cruise, Churchill learnt that his daughter Diana had committed suicide. Feeble and remote, he was spared the full impact of the tragedy.
He was tired of life, but he was a very peaceful person to be with. He was very warm and very affectionate, but one could sense the frustration from someone who'd had this extraordinary life to suddenly really just be existing.
On November the 10th, 1964, the family gathered to celebrate Winston's 90th birthday.
He was very frail by then. A little crowd gathered outside 28 Hyde Park Gate, and he came to the window to wave to them. And then in the evening, my mother gave a lovely party, and I know he was pleased to see us there, but I think we knew it was the last party.
6 weeks later, Winston Churchill suffered a massive stroke. He died on January the 24th, 1965, 70 years to the day after the death of his father, Lord Randolph. Churchill's state funeral was the greatest tribute staged for a subject this century. The nation mourned the man who had become a symbol of its own heroic past. Few now remembered the quarrels and contradictions of a life which was ending in a blaze of glory. Randolph Churchill died at the age of 57, surviving his father by only 3 years. Clementine outlived her husband by 12, long enough to see her grandson, Winston, gain a seat in Parliament.
I think for me that was undoubtedly the most moving journey of my life. The train went through suburban London as it circled round the southern suburbs to join the Great Western Line and head out to Blaydon. And at every house, the family members crowded round to pay their last respects. There were old soldiers there with their medals saluting as he went by. It was quite incredible, the outpouring of affection that there was for this one man.
We hope you've enjoyed the Churchills. In a moment, to look at The Face of Russia beginning next week. Then stay with us for Late Line.